So hello and welcome to the October 2022 Power Hour with Reloveution. Today we are going to be talking about the power question: how can we overcome generational stereotypes and challenges at work? We're going to provide you with some things to think about, some questions to ask yourself, some tools and resources and strategies to navigate intergenerational dynamics in your practice, but also in your workplace at large. And it's only going to be about a half hour, so we're not going to cover anything. We encourage you to reach out. Our contact information will be at the end, should you want to reach out and discuss anything about this content or the resources we're sharing on a deeper level. So let's get started. So I just want to start here by naming that these generational challenges are not new. And so this is an article or a meme or something that pulls out all the way from 1905 to 2022 newspaper headlines that are all saying the same thing. So nobody wants to work anymore, said in various different ways in every decade, coming from the early 20th century all the way into 2 decades into this century. So this is not new. It is also not unique. Generational challenges are things that our parents struggled with. It is something our grandparents struggled with, and it's natural and normal. So that is something I just want to start with, is that what we're talking about is not rocket science. It's also not a unique experience. So so some key ideas here. There is no universal acceptance on who is in what generation. So the dates here are sort of broad and they might fluctuate based on different resources that you see. But we've got our traditionalists, and there's still a few of them left in the workforce. About 2% of our workforce is made up of these people born between 1900 and 1945. Nobody from 1900 is still in the workforce. But some of the folks on the older edge of that are. We've got our baby boomers, represent 25% of the workforce at this point. We've got our Gen Xers, who are often left out of the generational conversations, coming in at 33%. Millennials now make up the highest percentage of people in the workforce at 35%. And then our Gen Zers are trickling in, and they will overtake us. When I say us, I fall into that millennial manager category. And they are going to overtake us soon. You'll see that there are some general themes and trends that are generally associated with each of these categories, with each of these generations. These are not hard, steadfast rules, but they are the things that most often come up as we're talking about different generations. I'm just going to say something quickly about Gen X. As a part of Reloveution's work, we do diagnostics around work culture and employee engagement. And very frequently, Gen X is the least satisfied organization when we are disaggregating by age. So I said they're generally forgotten because our boomers and our millennials are quite loud about their challenges, but Gen X is often the generation that comes up as suffering or the most frustrated, at least at this moment in time. So that just feels important to name. Again, generational differences are real, and there are huge individual differences between people of the same generation. So my experience as a millennial is not the same as other people's experiences as millennials. There are a number of people that I work with who fall into this generation of millennial who do not want to affiliate with the title millennial. And there are people who don't want to affiliate as boomers, or there are people in Gen X who feel like they're more affiliated with the millennial generation. All of that is fine. Part of this work is about recognizing that humans are humans, and there are huge individual differences that go above and beyond our age. because age and stage have impacts in the workplace, no matter what generation you are a part of. So when you are in your 20s, you are in a developmental phase of the workforce that does have to do with your generation based on your context and your experiences in the world. And just being in your 20s is a thing. Being in your 30s is a thing. Entering into parenthood is a thing. And so age and stage are really important, not just the generations that you are a part of. I also want to be really clear, given the context of this particular workshop, is that judgment is a two-way street. So a lot of times people will come to me and they'll say, what do I do with these damn Gen Zers? Or what do I do about my baby boomer boss who doesn't understand anything? And inherent in those questions are judgments of that other generation. But generally the judgments also go the other direction. And so as we are in here in this space today, it's important to recognize that judgment goes both ways. And even if we're experiencing it from someone else, we are often also perpetuating it. Stereotypes are harmful. We all know that. Because when we make assumptions about people, when we stereotype people, it makes people feel like they don't belong. It makes people feel threatened. It makes people feel that they're a part of a category, that they're being judged in some way. And that's really important to name as the foundation of what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm just looking at the chat to see if there are any questions. There aren't any, so let's move on. So I want to start by talking about overcoming stereotypes and age bias, and then we are going to move into managing across generations and some helpful workplace interventions and initiatives that you might think about. So our power question today is, how can we overcome stereotypes and age bias in workplaces? One of the things that is really critical here is that we have to remember that ultimately we can't control what people think about you, no matter how frustrating that is. So if your boss thinks that you're a silly millennial, or your direct report thinks you're an out of touch baby boomer, you ultimately can't control what they think. And part of this is about releasing that. We can do certain things to mitigate the circumstances and shift the narrative. And that's what we're going to focus on the rest of this slide. So one of the first things that we can do is we can actively challenge and debunk stereotypes and age bias. So below, these are some common millennial stereotypes. People tell us that we are disengaged, that we are entitled, that we're never satisfied, that we're overly certain about ourselves and the world, that we can't take feedback and criticism, that we're lazy. One of the things that we can do to overcome stereotypes is to actively debunk those stereotypes and to challenge them when they come up. So if somebody is telling us that we're just a typical entitled millennial, we want to respond to that. So this first part, so for example, if you're disengaged, actively participate. If you're disengaged, if someone's thinking that you're disengaged. If you want to overcome the bias of being entitled, you want to help others, you want to shout out the successes of others, and you use we language and ask others for input. And so you can't be labeled as entitled if you are doing those things. And I don't think anyone would argue that these things are good things to do in any role that you are in. If you are trying to overcome the stereotype of never being satisfied, you want to communicate your successes and share your goals and your gold stars, because millennials love gold stars. We want to ask questions and listen before speaking. When people say that, oh, those millennials can't take feedback or criticism, we want to ask for feedback and own up to our mistakes. All of these things are just about showing people and modeling for people that these stereotypes, while they are loud in the media, loud within our culture, they are not true for all millennials, and they are particularly not true for you, assuming that you are not these things. Something that I have found really helpful is when somebody comes up with something like, as a, like, you're just so entitled, like millennials are so entitled, or baby boomers are so critical, or whatever the stereotype is. I know that I had a boss once who said, I know that as a millennial, you care about all of this social justice-y stuff, right? And while that was true for me, a really helpful reframe for me and my experience has been, I've heard that about millennials too, but I've never felt or seen myself that way. Again, the social justice example is a bad one for me in particular. But if someone says, I know that as a millennial, you don't want to work past 5 o'clock, or you don't want to work hard, or you're never satisfied and you're just going to job hop in the next 2 years. Just reframing that as, this isn't me. I've never felt or seen myself that way. What evidence do you have that is me? That can be really helpful. You also want to remind yourself that there's a difference between truly being something and somebody feeling something about you. So if somebody thinks you're lazy, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're lazy. Doesn't mean that it's not frustrating that they think you're lazy, but when we take on these identities, it's hard to overcome the stereotype. Something I work on with companies and with leaders all the time is around communicating boundaries and preferences openly and if possible. Openly, and if possible, sharing why those boundaries and preferences are important to you. So if you have a hard stop at 5 o'clock, it's not because you're a lazy, entitled millennial who is never, or who doesn't think they have to work hard. It's because working or spending time with your children after work is important to you, or you participate in a choir or a dance class, and that actually fuels the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. And so when we communicate our boundaries and preferences with people and say why those things are important, it helps us mitigate that age bias, because people start connecting the dots on why a behavior is, not just, oh, this person is of a particular age group. Something that can be really helpful is to frame requests according to the preferences of your supervisor or your staff. This should say, or your staff. So if you have a person who is in a different generation, a good example of this is in terms of communication. So lots of millennials, including myself, hate the phone. Lots of boomers prefer to use the phone. And so when I got a 5-minute voicemail message from my boomer boss, I might respond to that with an email, and that would tick my boomer boss off because that's not their preferred preference. When we can adapt to the preferences without making ourselves super uncomfortable and moving into a danger zone in terms of safety, that can go a really, really long way. So we want to frame requests and demands and directives according to the people that the generational preferences or the individual preferences of the people we're talking to. Very often, by the time people come to me, there is an us versus them or me versus you dynamic that happens when we're talking about these things. We see this again culturally all of the time. Gen Xers versus millennials in the workplace, Gen Zers overtaking millennials. Workplaces need to be collaborative spaces. And yes, of course, these generational differences are important. But if we make it an us versus them thing, we are perpetuating divisiveness, and we are not allowing for there to be a middle ground. So that feels really important. We're going to talk more about that in the next section. When we are thinking about these things, we want to look for other clues as to why a person may be challenging your leadership or management other than your age. So I talk to people quite frequently who say, my boss just doesn't understand me because I'm a millennial, or I can't understand them because they're a Gen Zer. And so it's just really important that very often there's something other than your age contributing. So it might be a lack of trust. It might be a lack of cultural understanding. And when people are challenging us, when we jump to they're doing this because of my age, that means that we are going to continue perpetuating these dynamics. So really digging in, and it could be your age, right? But sometimes there are clues as to other reasons why a person might be challenging your leadership. We want to always be practicing curiosity about others, especially those older and younger than we are. We want to release our fear of being judged. And as much as possible, and as much as safe in your organizations, we want to share our concerns and clarify intentions. So if you feel like you are being discriminated against because of your age, or someone is inflicting a bias or stereotype on you because of your age, a really simple question to ask is, what do you mean by that? And that can be for really little things that may be microaggressions or not even real or passive aggressions. And it could be really big things that feel really frustrating and identity focused. So these are all things that we might think about in terms of overcoming stereotypes and age bias. Again, there's probably not that much surprising or new here, but it's important to remember that age isn't the only thing, and there are really little shifts that we can make in our practice to be able to support ourselves through this work. So I want to move us along to managing across generations. So when we did our introductions earlier, people said, I want to be able to better support my Gen Z staff, be better allies for people of other generations. And all of these things are going to be applicable, whether you're thinking about managing older people, younger people, or your same age people, because these generational dynamics, there are some universal things that we can do to help with management in these cases. The golden rule here is that everybody wants to feel valued. The 70-year-old CEO sitting in his golden chambers wants to feel valued. The entry-level human resources person who just graduated from college wants to feel valued. You want to feel valued. One of the #1 reasons why people leave roles and leave workplaces is because they don't feel valued. And so as we're thinking about managing across generations or managing people in general, we want to remember that everyone wants to feel valued. So our approach is to make them feel valued. At Reloveution, we talk a lot about empathy and compassion. One of the most powerful things that we can do when we're managing across generations is to practice empathy and offer generous interpretations. So somebody mentioned earlier that there may be technical divides or experiential divides or a difference in context in how somebody is approaching a workplace challenge. As opposed to jumping to judgment and saying, ugh, these boomers just don't understand, or ugh, the millennials are trying to take over this project. It's important to shift and really think about how to be empathetic in that moment. Trying to think about how to offer generosity and grace when somebody says something that we do not agree with. And when we can start from that place and practice translation, then we start to be able to move towards a middle ground where we are truly supporting one another and getting to take both experiences to find the best solution possible. Generally, there's not a right or wrong in these situations. There is a different. The right or wrong is if we edge into judgment or frustration or anger because somebody sees the world differently than we do. Really, really powerful when we're managing across generations to provide time and space for people to truly get to know each other. So if your different generations only know each other in terms of their jobs and the work that they're doing, it's going to be hard for them to find common ground. But when we truly create space for people to get to know people for who they are, we start to recognize the through line of humanity in all people. So we want to provide this space, if you are in a position to do so, either on your team or in the organization at large, for people to get to know each other, for people to understand each other's passions and uplift their strengths, to celebrate their children or their grandchildren or their dogs. And those things bridge divides. When we are managing across generations, we want to accept differences, but don't let people use differences as an excuse for being a jerk, which is really important to me. Difference is good. Diversity is important. And people don't get to use that as, well, I'm just different than you, or I guess we're never going to see eye to eye on this. They use that difference sometimes as an excuse for just not being a team player or not being a jerk, which is not what we're going for. So we want to accept differences without condition and show that we see generational diversity as an advantage. So everybody on our team has something to offer. If you are in a position where you are managing across generations, we need to make sure that we are challenging our own judgments and assumptions. So when somebody comes to us with an idea, are we putting it through the filter of they're just a Gen Zer, or of course they think that way, they're Gen X? We do this a lot and we do it unconsciously. And the more we can start to notice and then challenge our own judgments, the better off we're going to be as managers. We want to focus on individuals as much as possible rather than the generation that they're a part of. As a manager, you can amplify people's strengths and help them work on areas of weakness. That's something we should be doing with everybody, regardless of how old they are or where they fall on the generational spectrum. We also want to ask really thoughtful questions about people's individual boundaries and preferences, which we talked about on the previous slide. We want to create a culture of accountability and compassion. So we are looking out for people, we are practicing empathy, and we are challenging and holding people accountable when they are not meeting our expectations. This is something I talk about in a lot of different contexts, but it's particularly important when we're talking about managing across generations, because accountability and authority are two of the biggest tension points when we are talking about people who are older or younger. Gen Zers and millennials really believe in democracy and fair distribution of labor and having all voices be heard, while Gen Xers and boomers really believe that, and again, these are generalizations, but Gen Xers and boomers are more likely to believe that if I have the authority title, you should listen to me without question. I have worked really hard to get where I am. Both sides of that equation need to be held accountable when their actions are not in line with the workplace culture or with the team culture or the team expectations. This last piece is that we want to ask people what types of interactions feel most comfortable to them. This is what I call the platinum rule. And so just like we want to share our preferences and boundaries proactively, we want other people to be able to share their preferences and boundaries proactively. Last things here, and I'm going to wrap up in just about 3 to 4 minutes. So when we can, in terms of managing across generations, we want to step out of our comfort zones to honor and respect the preferences of others when possible and work culturally aligned. So I just talked about this, the platinum rule: treat others the way they want to be treated. We want to provide ongoing opportunities for people of all generations to share feedback and perspectives and actually use that feedback and perspective, which goes to this last point, which is that as much as possible, we want to make sure that all voices are heard and feel heard. And that feel part is really important. One of the most powerful things that we can do, and this goes to less about your individual management and more about how we're setting up workplaces, is that we need to be clear about what our culture is and what our workplace identity is and what workplace expectations are up front. These things may have to do with the leader's expectations, but when we're clear about those things, even before people are hired, that means that people know what they're buying into. So if this is an email culture, that should be in a job description or noted in the during interviews. If that's important to you, that we're using Slack or over email, or I want to be able to talk to somebody on the phone, those are questions we want to ask people so that you fit in, that other people fit in, and that everybody understands, respects, and are held accountable to the same rules, again, no matter what their generation is. This is the foundation of this work, is that every organization has a culture and a workplace identity. People need to fit into that. And hopefully that is a co-created culture and workplace identity. We want to make sure we're avoiding and challenging favoritism. And the last piece is that we cannot ignore these things. Sometimes I hear people say, well, those people are just going to retire in the next 2 years anyway. Or those people are just going to job, like they don't, Gen Zers don't stay more than a year anyway. So I'm just going to wait until they leave. We cannot ignore these things. They are real, they impact the way we work together, and we have to address generational conflicts and misunderstandings immediately, which means we need to create conflict competence, feedback competence, and communication competence within organizations, just in general. So some helpful things, diversity and inclusion training very frequently focuses on race, but age is a big piece of diversity and inclusion training. So if that's something you would like to do or your organization should be a part of, start thinking about that. Conflict competence training can be really helpful. Mentoring programs where people who are older or younger have the opportunity to mentor people who are older or younger. And mentoring goes both ways. It does not have to be an older person mentoring a younger person, but mentoring programs help us mitigate some of these generational challenges. When we implement coaching and personalized professional development plans, this goes a really long way in breaking down some of those generational barriers, because everyone gets these things and everyone is getting customized support, particularly around specific skills. And Reloveution does a lot of these things. So we have a program called the Team Program, which is all about breaking down how people think differently and how to be able to see and hear people across all difference. That might be something that you're interested in. And we also do professional coaching and advisory that often touches on these dynamics. This is not an inclusive list, but it is a starting point. I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to answer questions and also have some discussion around this for the people who are tuning in live. So for those of you who are watching the recording of this, if you would like to follow up, my contact information is here, and I look forward to having a conversation with you about your multi-generational workplace or your practice as a leader of a multi-generational team. And I invite you to think about these questions for yourself. So what questions do you still have? Reach out with them. I'm happy to answer. What ideas do you have to offer from your own experience? How do you experience these generational stereotypes or age bias in your workplace? And maybe what did you take away from today that you want to shift in your own practice? Thank you so much. And I'm again looking forward to hearing from anyone who would like to follow up.